Good day. I'm Andrea Spindle, Executive Director of the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation and your moderator for today's webinar, Winning the Fight Against Anti-Semites and Anti-Zionists, featuring our guest, James Sinkinson. Before I introduce James, I would like to thank today's presenting sponsor, Eric Weiss, and our many wonderful promotional sponsors, European Lawyers for Israel, End Jew Hatred Canada, the Mattathias Project, the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, Club Z, Rhode Island Coalition for Israel, Muslims Facing Tomorrow, Adith Israel Congregation, the Lawfare Project, the Lodger Synagogue, Cherut Canada, Atlanta Israel Coalition, Beth Tikva Synagogue, Jewish Resistance, Americans for a Safe Israel, the Israel Committee of Sonoma County, North Carolina Coalition for Israel, Friends of Jesus Christ, the Israel Activist Calendar, Israel Action Committee of the East Bay, Facts and Logic About the Middle East, and the Zionist Organization of America. The list of sponsors and partners is growing and includes NGOs from across the pond and friends in the US. If your organization would also like to sponsor a webinar with CAEF, please send me a message at Andrea, A-N-D-R-I-A, at caef.ca, and I will send you a list of upcoming webinars. All webinars are recorded, and you can access all of them on our website, www.caef.ca. You can also access the website to make a secure donation online. Funds will help support our ongoing webinar series, our new educational project for public schools, and our technical costs for services that include our website, bulletins, and also advocacy. If there is an issue that is demonstrably anti-Zionist, let us know, and we will either respond or guide you in responding. CAEF is committed to fighting the lies and bigotry and the danger posed by anti-Zionism. It is astounding that there are Jews and Jewish organizations that think nothing of pillaring Israel, denying Jewish history in Israel, smearing the good works and humanitarian outreach extended by Israel, which is greater than that of any other country. There is precedence for this self-hating and ostracization, and it always ends badly. The Jews of the past who were in denial of their Judaism, who distanced themselves from their outwardly obvious brothers, sisters, and cousins, as well as those Jews who wanted only social acceptance, but ultimately succumbed to assimilation, were not spared by Jew haters who committed pogroms, terrorism, and genocide. Zionism isn't a 20th century invention, a colonial project, or a racist endeavor, nor is it a mere political movement. I know I'm speaking to the choir here today, but I'm doing so to give all of us the courage to do so, to repeat the truth and stand up and squash the lies. CAEF is proudly Jewish, and we are building pride and resilience through knowledge and through collaboration with all of you listening today and those who will be listening to this recording. Zionism is a core part of our identity as Jews. It is the belief and love of Israel as the national homeland of the Jewish people. Zionism is part of our ethno-religious identity as a people. Not every Jew feels that they are a Zionist, and each of us may express it differently, just as all Jews don't keep kosher or keep Shabbat in the same way. Individuals are entitled to feel non-Zionist and to experience any level of religious observance, but they are not entitled to be anti-Zionist. That suggests they want Israel to cease to exist. And that, friends, is tantamount to calling for the destruction of the country, the eradication of Israelis, and it is not less than a call for genocide, which is what many of Israel's neighbors want. And it is what the entire boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement stands for, while pretending to be about peaceful resistance. So do not be cowed, do not be tricked, do not fall for false narratives and the arguments that we must be balanced and consider the Palestinian Arab distorted views and lies in order to be, quote, fair. It is not our job as Jews to support myths, lies, fantasies, and slanders. James Sinkinson, president of FLAME, which stands for Facts and Logic About the Middle East, is a staunch supporter of truth, undisguised Zionism, and the logic that is in the telling of our story. He has served on the board of FLAME since 2006, managing its website and serving as editor of its weekly hotline e-newsletter. In recent years, he has written Flame's outspoken messages in the media and on its website, which serves as a resource for pro-Israel advocates. Everyone can use these materials to compose letters to the editor, to elected representatives, and in discussions with friends and family, and I would add also with enemies, or at the least the ill-informed. I know from speaking with James that he has an extensive writing, publishing, and public relations background. It is refreshing to see how he has applied it to writing about, publishing about, and promoting Israel. That is, the truth about Israel, to counter all the lies. James and his wife made Aliyah in 2020. Flame is an organization that refutes misinformation about the state of Israel, and that's what's unique. They do it by publishing paid educational messages in the mainstream Jewish and social media. And I have to say that I don't know how his bulletin came to my attention, but I was so impressed when I first saw it, and the fact that there are embedded ads that others can use. Here is an entity that is spreading the truth in detail in mainstream newspapers and not battling with the established Jewish organizations as to what can be said diplomatically. It's not full of niceties and giving equal space to verbiage about all the hatreds, all the rights of all minorities, or the buried truth about the hideous things being done to the Jews. It is upfront. It states that Israel has defended itself against Palestinian attacks, that Arabs are killed as a result of Palestinian aggression, and that Israel famously avoids harming civilians. It gives me great pleasure to invite James to speak now, after which he will take questions, and our question and answer session will be moderated by Anita Bromberg, the president of CAEF. Our webinar is being recorded and will be available to everyone. Thank you for being here today, and James, welcome.
Wow, Andrea, I'm just very inspired by that introduction, not the introduction of me, but the introduction of the mission that we are all on. Very inspiring. Thank you, and thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be here with so many supporters of Israel, so many people committed to helping Israel defeat her enemies. Israel is certainly under threat almost daily in the media, on college campuses, and from international organizations. So this webinar is extremely important. So greetings from Israel, happy to be with you. Before we start, let me tell you a humorous story to help set the scene. On pleasant days, Moshe eats his lunch outside in the plaza next to the building where he works. On this particular day, during Pesach, his wife packs him a bag with tuna salad in a plastic box, a few pickles, and several pieces of matzah. Moshe sits down on a bench next to a stranger who happens to be blind. Since Moshe does not like matzah so much, he taps on the man's shoulder, puts a piece of matzah in his hand, and asks, "Would you like this?" Because the man does not want to offend Moshe, he slowly runs his hands over the matzah to understand what it is. Suddenly, he lifts his glance and asks Moshe, "Who writes this crap?" This story not only gives us a humorous look at Pesach, but it also leaves us with a pointed question about those who attack Israel and attack us Zionists who support the Jewish state. Nearly every day in mainstream media, we read or hear outright lies, vicious slanders, or unfair innuendo against Israel. Like the man in the little story, we might fairly ask, who writes this crap? Perhaps more importantly, you've probably asked yourself, as I certainly have, what can we do to fight back against all these false claims about Israel? Let me start by telling you a little about my organization, Facts and Logic About the Middle East, Flame. Then let's talk about what our research shows to be the 10 most common attacks against the Jewish state. Finally, I'd like to share some ideas about how you can and should respond to these lies, slanders, and innuendo. I'll give you 5 practical actions you as a supporter of Israel can take to defend her without spending a lot of time and money. There's a lot of ground to cover, and we have a lot of work that needs to get done. So let's dive in. First, you and I are not the first supporters of Israel to notice how the mainstream media mistreat the world's only Jewish state. Back in 1989, 33 years ago, a Holocaust survivor, Gerardo Jaffe, found a Holocaust survivor and a successful American businessman, started Flame to correct the lies and misrepresentations that he saw and heard in the press. To fight back, Mr. Jaffe started publishing outspoken editorial ads in newspapers and magazines across North America. And today we publish in mainstream media like the New York Times, Washington Post, and the Chicago Tribune, and others to correct lies and misstatements about Israel by using facts and logic. The idea of Flame is to run position papers, editorial ads in publications like the New York Times, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, and many others to correct lies and misstatements about Israel by using facts and logic. Flame does PR for Israel. In addition to our editorial ads, Flame also publishes free weekly updates for Israel supporters on the hottest issues in the news to help Israel advocates like you respond using the truth to fight false information about Israel that appears in the media. So who pays for this PR? Flame's messages in the media are today supported by tens of thousands of individual donors who make modest financial contributions to our work. You can see Flame's educational messages at www.factsandlogic.org. And I'll give you that link at the end. We at Flame believe that the single biggest problem Israel faces is ignorance and misinformation. And such organizations as the UN and Amnesty International spread most of this information, some of it out of ignorance, but most of it out of nefarious motives, and chiefly anti-Semitism. In essence, these attacks on Israel form the foundation and scaffolding for efforts to delegitimize and ultimately destroy Israel. In fact, in my analysis, some 99% of the bad press Israel receives is based on falsehood. And the greatest falsehood of all of these is that stories are mere criticism of Israel. The truth is, most are not criticism meant to help Israel do a better job. They are lies and slanders. Like any democracy, Israel is aware of its shortcomings and its failures to create a perfect society. I believed this to be true before I moved to Israel, and certainly living here convinces me of it. Israel has a good heart. Israel wants to do the right thing by all people. The truth is that like any democracy, like Canada, like the United States, Israel strives to help its people survive and thrive. It welcomes constructive criticism, but the lies against Israel are generally not meant to help Israel survive and thrive. On our website, you'll find short articles that can equip you to defend Israel against these attacks, to help you talk or write more persuasively about most of any issue concerning Israel. Right now, I'd like to quickly review 10 of the most common falsehoods used to attack Israel that we all see in the media and that Flame encounters from enemies of Israel every day on our Facebook site. For each of these issues, I'll offer you a short summary of how we believe you can convincingly answer and defeat these attacks. Finally, I'll outline 5 ways you can support Israel and the truth about Israel in your daily life, even if you don't have much time or a lot of money to donate. Let me also say, if you have any questions about anything that I've said so far, or as we get into the falsehoods that we're going to cover, please write your questions in the chat, and we will answer them all at the end. Before we start, let me emphasize one important point. These responses, if you're talking to a person with Israel derangement syndrome, a person with Israel derangement syndrome is called a PIDS. These responses to attacks on Israel will not help you change the attacker or help you. It will just make you crazy. And I think before you get into arguments with people about issues about Israel, you need to make that distinction. You need to qualify the person. If the person does not support the Jewish state of Israel, there's no sense in arguing with the person. No argument will convince that kind of person. But if you're talking to someone who believes in facts and logic, I think you'll find these responses useful. If the person believes in being reasonable, if the person wants to learn, these responses are useful. Otherwise, I would really advise you to not waste your time, your energy, and your spirit by arguing with people who hate Israel. So here's the most common attack on Israel these days by far. Let me bring it up on the slide. Oh, sample of an ad by Flame, just to give you an example. And if you go to www.factsandlogic.org, you can see our full collection of the ads that we run in media. And this is the most recent one, or one of the most recent ones we ran about Ben & Jerry's. And of course, very happy with the heat that Unilever, the owner of Ben & Jerry's, is coming under since that ad and other activities by people like you have been mounted. The most important attack that we see against Israel, and the most frequent these days, is that Israel is an apartheid state. So unlike apartheid South Africa, so this is what in a brief explanation focused on facts that we think will serve you well when you hear people talk about apartheid. Unlike apartheid South Africa, Israel has no laws or regulations that separate or limit the rights of its citizens by race, religion, or ethnicity. Israeli Arabs serve in every level of Israel's government, including the Supreme Court, and they have equal access to all education and professional opportunities. As Andrea mentioned earlier, I know that we are talking to the choir here, but what I want to focus on, or help you focus on, is to make sure that your argument is based on factual information, and that you shouldn't need a lot of facts to defeat this argument. However, this is just the beginning of a conversation that you might have with someone, and they may come back with additional questions. One question they might ask is, well, how about the Arabs who live outside of Israel, those who are not citizens? And we would say the same thing. Israel has no laws or regulations that discriminate against people who are not citizens because of their race, religion, or ethnicity, right? The United States does not discriminate against people because they are Hispanic. They may discriminate against people because they are El Salvadoran, because they are Mexican, because they are Colombian, because they are not the nationality, they are not of American nationality, and Canada no doubt does the same thing. So apartheid is discrimination because of race, religion, or ethnicity. Israel does not do that. And a question that we might ask after presenting this is, to the person who talks about Israel being an apartheid state, we might say, you must have a new definition of apartheid. Please explain how you use that word to describe Israel. And of course, I can tell you our experience when we confront people on Facebook and in other venues with that question, they usually have no answer, because they are not making this accusation, attacking Israel based on facts, but rather are mouthing what they have read in the media, or they have read in a Amnesty International report, but are not really familiar with the perversion of that term by Amnesty International. So that's the first, most important, the highest profile attack on Israel. Let's look at a few more. The next falsehood is that Israel commits ethnic genocide. And we heard this with Mark Ruffalo, an actor who made that claim. He was called on it and retracted it, said that that accusing Israel of genocide promotes anti-Semitism, and he was absolutely right. A few weeks later, a student made the comment to Kamala Harris, Vice President Kamala Harris, that Israel commits ethnic genocide. And she said, you have to tell your truth. No one should stop you from telling your truth. This was, of course, this was the wrong thing to say to that student. Kamala Harris should have denied the truth of what she said and refuted it, but she did not. She later came back with an explanation for why she didn't, but it wasn't very convincing. Here's how we would answer that attack. Unlike the Holocaust or other historical genocides, which methodically murdered millions, Israel does not attack, let alone kill, any people because of their ethnicity ever. It doesn't happen. It hasn't happened. What's more, the populations of Arab Palestinians and Israeli Arabs have grown massively since Israel's founding. So these facts refute genocide. It's really all you need to say, although it helps to have more background in case you get further questions. But again, we would ask the person who utters this attack, given these facts, what evidence can you cite of genocide by Israel? And again, it's impossible to produce examples of genocide by Israel because Israel does not commit genocide. So a few facts are a fairly direct and simple way to refute this accusation. The third falsehood that we see a lot, and you probably do too, is that Israel opposes a Palestinian state. And our response to that is, let's remind them of the facts. Israel, supported by the United States, has offered the Palestinians land for their own state many times, including in 2000, 2001, and 2008. The Palestinians have rejected every single offer of peace, largely because they reject the existence of a Jewish state in the Middle East. They continue to reject that. Mansour Abbas, who is an Arab member of the current Israeli government, recently made a statement that Israel was founded as a Jewish state. There's no sense in fighting that. It will always be a Jewish state. And both Hamas, the terrorist group in Gaza, and Fatah, the group in Judea and Samaria, in the West Bank, both condemned Mansour Abbas as a traitor to their cause for accepting the fact of a Jewish state of Israel. So I think that that's pretty good evidence that, the Palestinians have never in peace negotiations accepted a Jewish state. Also, the Palestinians have refused to enter negotiations since 2014. So it is not Israel that opposes a Palestinian state. Israel has made many offers. The Palestinians simply are not motivated to create a state. They may be afraid to create a state, if the truth be known. But we don't need to conjecture. The point is, they've been offered a state. They refuse to negotiate. To expect Israel to do more is beside the point and would be foolish. Although United States and other nations attempt to pressure Israel to do more to create a state. But if it takes two to tango. If the Palestinians do not want a state, they will not get a state. And so far, they have not wanted one. Falsehood number 4. Israel occupies Palestinian land. And we see this comes out of the UN, comes out of the EU, and it comes out of the mouths of some members of the current American administration, and quite possibly people of authority in Canada. Historically and legally, there's no such thing as public Palestinian land. There is no such thing as Palestinian land. The Palestinians have never owned or controlled a square inch of this territory. If anyone says or writes about Palestinian territory or Israel occupying Palestinian land, it's simply not true. Jews are the indigenous people of Palestine with 3 sovereign commonwealths over a 3,000-year history. Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, are technically disputed territories. They are not Palestinian territories, and they have never been Palestinian territories. So the question we would ask somebody, a follow-up question to these facts, is, how and when do you believe the Palestinians acquired this territory? How and when do you believe they acquired it? And what are the boundaries of the Palestinian territories or Palestinian land? Of course, it will be impossible for anybody to answer that question factually, because the Palestinians have never had it. There's never been a treaty. There's never been an agreement. There's never been any kind of legal or administrative method by which that they could have acquired any land, let alone have a state. So this is again a falsehood that we should not allow to stand, and it can be defeated very quickly with a few facts. Falsehood number 5: Israel is stealing Palestinian land. And we have seen this a lot in the news over the last few months, particularly a neighborhood in Jerusalem called Sheikh Jarrah, where a number of Palestinians who are living there are being evicted, not by the government of Israel, but by the legal system, the civil legal system in Israel. And the reason that they're being evicted, or that they have not been evicted, but that the legal machinations are in place to do that, is because they do not have the deed to the land. They agreed some decades ago to pay rent on the land, but they have refused to pay. They agreed, but they have refused to pay the rent. And the legal owners of that land, the people with the deed for that land, are moving to have them evicted, since they don't own the land and they refuse to pay rent. And the owners would like to create a park out of this area for the use by all members of the Sheikh Jarrah community, including Arabs and Jews. So property, unlike most countries in the Middle East, Israel operates by rule of law. Property disputes are settled by the courts. It's not settled by Netanyahu. It's not settled by Bennett. It's not settled by any politicians. It's settled by judges. However, when the Ottomans and then the Jordanians ruled Palestine, they evicted many Jewish property owners. Today, dispossessed Jews go to civil authorities, as you would and I would, to reclaim their property. But many Palestinians with no legal ownership protest. Now, what you hear, what you read in the newspaper is, these families have lived there for generations. And it's true. They've lived there for 50 years. They lived there for 70 years since Israel became a state, right? It wasn't, however, it was never their land. They were squatters then, and 70 years later, they are squatters now. So 98% of these disputes are because the Palestinians who are making claims on these properties don't own it, okay? There may be some cases in which Palestinians, in which Jews are unjustifiably, unjustly trying to take Palestinian land. That's why we have courts. That happens in the United States, it happens in Canada, it happens in Germany, it happens everywhere. There are always property disputes and they're settled by the courts. The difference here is that the Palestinians do not accept the authority of the courts. They accept the idea that they have lived there for 70 years and feel that that is a reason enough that they should possess that land. So there's a cultural difference here but also a legal difference. So that's number 5. Falsehood number 6, Israel is desecrating the Temple Mount. We hear this regularly here in Israel, but certainly you read about it there. Every time there is violence in Israel, in Jerusalem or elsewhere, let alone last May's firing of 4,500 missiles from Gaza to all of central Israel. The reason was that Israel was desecrating, quote unquote, desecrating the Temple Mount, or the Palestinians were afraid that Israel would desecrate the Temple Mount. What does that mean, desecrate the Temple Mount? Well, Palestinian clergy and politicians use this lie as an excuse to provoke violence against Israel. Some Muslims think that any Jewish presence near Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is at the top, on top of the Temple Mount, is offensive. Yet it is the site of the first and second Jewish temples, long before Arabs had moved into this land. Nonetheless, Israel has protected the Temple Mount status quo for 74 years. Jews are allowed on a very limited basis onto the Temple Mount. They are not allowed to pray visibly there. They can't go into to the Muslim holy places there, but nonetheless, Palestinian leaders still use the red herring of desecration as an excuse for violence. But Israel does not desecrate the Temple Mount in any way, nor the Al-Aqsa Mosque or any of the holy areas on top of it. So the question I would ask someone who brings this up is, can you name a single case in which Israel actually defiled these Muslim holy sites? You might also ask, I was reading something the other day, if you are not a Catholic and you walk by St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City, are you desecrating the church because you walk by the front of it? Well, a lot of Muslims here believe that Jews on top of the Temple Mount, our Temple Mount, that their presence there desecrates the building in which there is a mosque. So there are a lot of issues here, but factually, the issue is simple. Israel has protected the Temple Mount status quo for 74 years and has every intention of continuing to do that as far as we know. But there has been no desecration of the Temple Mount or Al-Aqsa Mosque. So falsehood number 7. Anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. And we get this all the time on our Facebook feed, on our Facebook pages. People write and say, I'm so sick of every time I say something negative about Israel, they call me anti-Semitic. It's getting old, it doesn't mean anything. Well, anti-Semitism is a thing. It has a definition, okay? And we can discuss that very briefly here. But many people who oppose Israel's existence claim that when they merely criticize Israel, they're accused of anti-Semitism. In fact, they're right. Criticizing Israel's policies is not anti-Semitic. But anti-Zionists attempt to demonize and delegitimize Israel and hold the Jewish state to a double standard. Those are the 3 Ds, each of which is a marker of anti-Semitism. To demonize Israel, to say that Israel commits genocide when nothing could be further from the truth, or that it is an apartheid state, that's demonization. It's a lie and it's not true. Delegitimize Israel, to say Israel, the Palestinians are always saying, the myth of Jewish indigeneity, that Jews are the indigenous people of this, or that Jews have thousands of years of history in the Holy Land, that's a myth. So these are attempts to delegitimize Israel, or say that Israel is a colonialist state, a white colonialist state. Why would somebody say that? Number one, there are more Sephardic Jews, Eastern and North African Jews in Israel than there are European Jews, Ashkenazi Jews. But what difference does it make? Israel is here because the Jewish people have created a state here. To call it a European colonial enterprise is only to change the subject. So denying the self-determination of the Jewish people, and only the Jewish people, and you'll find people who deny Israel's right to exist, don't object to the statehood of Jordan, which was born at the same time, by the Hashemite kingdom, not Palestinian Arabs, by a minority of the people. Same with Syria, but you don't find these same people objecting to these and other nations around the world. It's only Israel that is illegitimate. So that singling out Israel is also anti-Semitic. The facts, the facts, the facts. So let's look at the 8th falsehood. Israel's settlements prevent peace. And Thomas Nides, who is the new ambassador for the Biden administration, was recently in Israel and also speaking, I think, to Peace Now organization, and saying how upset he was about the settlements in Judea and Samaria, and how annoyed he was and how stupid it was of Israelis to be forming these Jewish communities. So our response to that is Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, which are the ancient homelands of historical and present day Jewish people, do not prevent the Palestinians from having a state. Let's just get that straight. They do not prevent it. In fact, there were no settlements in those regions before 1967, when Israel won the Six-Day War. But even then, before the 67 war, the Palestinians opposed Israel. They opposed the Jewish state, and they still refused to make peace with Israel. So before there were settlements, the Palestinians refused, and after there were settlements, the Palestinians now use that, and others, including some American diplomats, use that as a reason that there's no peace there. Yet we know the real reason that there's no peace between the Palestinians and Israel. It's because the Palestinians refuse to accept a Jewish state. One other thing that you may not be aware of is that most Jewish settlements are in parts of Judea and Samaria in which Jews are the majority population. So there's a settlement block, a group of settlements, about 400,000 people live there. This is in Judea and Samaria. And in that region, if you draw a circle around it, the majority of people within that block of land, that piece of land, the majority are Jews who live in it. And it's quite a large piece of Judea and Samaria. So Palestinians are claiming all of that land, even though a majority of much of that area is now Jewish. So kind of an ironic, and it's not a point that, again, American diplomats are quick to acknowledge. In fact, they never acknowledge it. They want all the settlements ripped out. And we know that is not going to happen. Falsehood number 9, US aid to Israel is a gift the US can't afford. We get this all the time, especially the whole idea that foreign aid is a gift to Israel, and that the Jews are getting all our money, are taking our taxpayers' money. What they don't realize is that foreign aid is not a gift, it's an investment, and particularly the investment in Israel. Israel is one of the US's strongest allies, unlike Pakistan, unlike Afghanistan, unlike many countries that receive foreign aid. Israel is one of the United States' most strongest allies, consistent allies, sharing powerful values and global political interests. The US invests hundreds of millions of dollars in the Palestinians, and the Palestinians cheer when the Twin Towers were bombed in 2001. And when other misfortune occurs in the United States, they cheer. That's not what happens in Israel. The US invests about $3.8 billion in military aid to Israel, military aid, while Israel protects US interests in the Middle East with cyber intelligence and armed actions against mutual enemies, and particularly Iran. The return on this investment is far greater than the cost of aid to Israel. The most important point here is it is an investment that the United States makes, and it's a hard-nosed investment. It's investment that pays off with an extremely high ROI. The question I would ask somebody who raises this objection or makes this attack is, can you think of a single foreign aid investment or expenditure that returns more to the United States than our investment in Israel? And most people don't know anything about any other foreign aid except the one to Israel that they object to, and that it's so much money taken out of our pockets. And in fact, the United States invests billions and billions more on other countries, most of whom do not support the United States the way Israel does. And falsehood number 10. Israel supports Russia, not Ukraine. I was talking with a friend of mine just a few days ago, and a guy who's very supportive of Israel, but he wanted to know what was going on. And I said, well, what have you heard? And he said, I hear that Israel hasn't come forward to support Ukraine and hasn't come out against Russia. So let's look at the facts. In fact, Israeli leaders have publicly opposed Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I will say that it took a few days for that to happen, and I'll explain the reason why. They also hosted Ukrainian President Zelensky in a presentation to the Knesset. And I don't know what greater support you could give to a head of state who's under attack. And Zelensky made a very powerful but also controversial presentation. Israel depends on Russia, and this is the real point. It's complicated, as world diplomacy and politics are. Israel depends on Russia, which controls the airspace in Syria, which is just on Israel's border, to allow it to attack its enemy, Iran, which is arming itself on Israel's border with Syria. And it's also using Syria, roads in Syria, to move military equipment, weapons to Lebanon, to Hezbollah, which is also on Israel's border. Israel has flown thousands of operations against Iranian assets in Syria without Russian interference. And there is an agreement between Israel and Russia in which Israel informs Russia that an attack is going to come. And Russia stands aside. It gets out of the way and it stands aside and allows Israel to do what it needs to do to oppose Iran. That makes Russia an extremely important relationship on the foreign arena. And it's important that Israel protect that relationship. Now, Israel has condemned Russia's invasion and it has supported the Ukrainian people. Israel has also welcomed more than 12,000 Ukrainian refugees. Okay, so with Israel has about 1/40 of the population of the United States. So multiply 12,000 times 40, and you would come up with 480,000 refugees. In equivalency, the United States has not accepted 480,000 Ukrainians. They are not there. So Israel has in fact been very generous with Ukraine, and it's been very firm in its opposition to Russia, while still trying to maintain a close relationship that will allow it to continue to do what it needs to do against Iran. So it's a complicated situation. I've given you the long version here, but the short version is on the slide. Israel has publicly opposed Russia's invasion. It has supported the Ukrainian people and happily does both of those things. But it's more complicated than just that. So having established some of these positions and some of the facts that you can use to defeat arguments or attacks against Israel. My next question is, and this is the main theme of our webinar today, is how can you join the fight against Israel's enemies? Don't have much time, don't have much money, but you still love Israel and want to make a difference? That's a lot of people feel that way, but the truth is you don't need to sit on the sidelines. If you love Israel and you want to make a contribution of any type, there are ways to do it. And I came up with 5 ways that I think are very important. There are probably 10 or 20, but here are, I think, the 5 most important ways that you can contribute. Defeat the lies and the efforts to delegitimize and dismantle the Jewish state. So the first point I would make is educate yourself. This sounds very obvious, but it's easy, it's free, and it takes just a few minutes a day. How do you do that? Stay up to date on the events and issues that affect Israel. Follow the news and read the top commentators. How can you do that? Well, I suggest subscribing to several pro-Israel news services. One, of course, is Flame, near and dear to my heart. And there's a link there, or if you go to factsandlogic.org, you will see a subscribe button, several of them. Also, the Jewish News Syndicate I like a lot. I subscribe to it. I read it every day. It's a daily. The hotline is a weekly, but it's more longer pieces. But the Jewish News Syndicate is excellent for the news. It's also excellent for a complete collection of commentators, experts who write opinion pieces. And then there's the Daily Alert, which is let me just, for my notes, It is from the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. And it comes out twice a week, and it's just quick summaries of news and commentary about Israel. If you subscribe to 2 of those, let alone all 3 as I do, you will quickly become an expert and be able to talk to most anybody about most any topic having to do with Israel. So I strongly recommend that you educate yourself. That's the first thing. That's the least expensive thing you can do. It's the thing that takes the least amount of time. Secondly, speak up when you hear someone malign Israel. This is hard for a lot of people. And it has been hard for me and my own family over the dinner table, because I have some people in my family who are rather radical left. And you have to ask yourself, is it worth disturbing dinner to have a discussion about Israel? But I'm not asking you to bring it up or to challenge somebody, but if somebody says something, I feel we need to speak up. And Andrea mentioned this word, and I will repeat it. We need to have the courage when we hear someone diss Israel at work, in the synagogue, at your dinner table, and if you're a student, at school. It takes courage. It's not easy. And so courage won't cost you time, it won't cost you money, but it comes from your spirit, it comes from your soul. And Israel needs your courage, and we need your courage. When we hear a lie about Israel or an unfair statement, we can't just let it go. We need to speak the truth. You need to speak the truth. We don't have to be harsh, and we don't have to make it a personal issue. We don't want to attack people. And as you can see in the issues that I brought up, none of those are personal attacks. We stick to the facts. Just focus on the facts. Just say what is true. And I think that's the high road on this issue. Write letters to the editor. When you see articles in your local newspaper that are untrue or slanted against Israel, or you see letters to the editor from enemies of Israel or from those who support Israel, write back. Letters to the editor don't need to be long. In fact, they should be very short, but they should also be factual and thoughtful. And that's where your education will help you. It's hard to write a great letter to the editor in 10 minutes, I'll be honest, but we can write one in an hour, a short one. Write a letter once a month. If everyone here would write one letter a month, we could really start to make some waves. So I encourage you, if you are a writer, if you're comfortable with that, consider becoming a regular writer of letters. 4, volunteer to help organizations like the sponsors of this webinar. Andrea, you did an amazing job of recruiting these sponsors. Thank you for bringing all of us together. It's extremely valuable. There are hundreds of people on this call. We can make a difference. You can volunteer to help these nonprofits, and most of them will welcome your support and will have ways that you can help. Most will only ask a few hours per week or even per month of your time. But if you can help these groups bring pro-Israel speakers to your town, or persuade people to sign petitions, or show up at demonstrations, you can actively help spread the truth about Israel. You can make a difference in how people perceive Israel. And that's huge. So again, it won't cost you any money. It won't cost you much time, but you will be there. You'll be taking part. So I encourage you to consider that. And then the last item is to indeed make small donations, financial donations to pro-Israel groups. You don't have to be wealthy to support Israel and support groups like the sponsors of today's webinar. You don't have to give $1,000 or even $100. I know that it's it's inhibiting. When you think, oh, I'm not a big mocker, I can't afford to give all kinds of money. No, you don't have to. The average donation to Flame is about $27. And thousands of people donate just $5 or $10 to Flame. Do the math. 5,000 people at $10 a piece is $50,000. That's a lot of money. Your $5 or $10 will make a difference. Of course, your $50 makes a bigger difference, but it doesn't have to be a large amount. We are happy. We're grateful for a $5 donation from someone. If you can be one of these people, you'll be a huge help to telling the truth about Israel, whether it's Flame or any of the sponsors of this webinar. Just find it in your heart and just take the few minutes to write a check or go to their website and make a small $5, $10, $50 donation. It will make a difference. So these are 5 ways, starting with the very easiest to steps that require slightly more commitment, but I think they're within the scope of everybody on this webinar today. So I will leave you with this question and a few words that I wrote. Yeah, I think in short, the most important way to help Israel is to do something. If you act, if you take part not just in Flame, not just with the other organizations that sponsored this event, but you take part in the history of Israel. You become part of that. You become a defender of Israel. You make a difference in the history of Israel as we move forward. So help us fight Israel's enemies, play a part in Israel's amazing, miraculous history, become part of that miracle. So I will leave you, at least with this part of our webinar, with the question, what steps will you take to help defeat Israel's enemies? I hope you will take some steps. If I haven't inspired you, surely Andrea's comments at the beginning of the webinar should do that. My contact information is here. The website address is here. If you care to write to me, jim@factsandlogic.org, please feel free. I'd love to hear from you. Andrea and Anita.
We're going to take a few more minutes. Thanks, James. That was wonderful and inspiring. If you would stop share. Good. Okay. So Anita's going to come on. We know that we're going to run over time, but there's some excellent questions. I'm sure people would like to hear from you. So Anita, would you like to start the question and answer period, and we'll go for another 15 to 20 minutes? Thank you.
I just have to start my video. 1 second. There we go. Yes. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, James. That was really fascinating. Lots of questions. I don't think even in the allotted extra time we're going to get to everybody's, but I'm going to try to walk you through as many as we can. I've sort of see them in 4 big categories. People want to know a bit more about you yourself, a bit more about the organization, a lot more about your tactics, and then they have some specific questions from your slides about what works and what doesn't work. So let me see if I can walk you through some of those questions. Let's start with the more about you. How did you say you've been doing this since 1989, if I was following, and you describe yourself as a Zionist. Was there something that prompted that journey?
Well, I have been involved in Flame started in 1989, not by me. I joined in 2006. I am a Jew by choice, and I am not a strictly Orthodox religious Jew. I am Jewish. I do practice Judaism, but a big attraction to me when I became Jewish, and the reason that I became Jewish was to be part of the Jewish people. And it became very clear to me as I joined you all that the pinnacle of that identification was the state of Israel. And, you know, when I took my first trip to Israel 30 years ago, you know, I was one of those who got down on the tarmac because we didn't go into the terminal. We got off on a stairway down to the tarmac. I got down and kissed the ground, you know. So it's always been very moving for me. The state of Israel, what Israel represents for the Jewish people. So I'll just leave it at that.
Well, that was great. Okay, let me turn to a couple of the questions around Flame specifically. A very narrow question, but maybe we can put it out of the way. It's a not-for-profit? Is it a charitable?
It is a 501c3. It's a nonprofit.
And I'm gonna throw one in there that I'm curious about. Have you been slapped with much lawfare problems given your work? Have you faced any lawsuits, any use of the law to counter your message?
No, the answer is no. Baruch Hashem, happy about that. But I will say that our ads, when we try to run them, our most recent ad, which is the Israel genocide slander, was refused by the New York Times. They refused to run it. Although we did run in the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, Orlando Sentinel, Houston Chronicle, and the New York Post without incident, with no objections whatsoever. The New York Times came back to us with about 20, including some changes they demanded that we felt would be a lie, and we refused to spend that kind of money to run lies about Israel. So our problems have really been with the media monopoly, not with the state.
Okay.
And we're so happy that
Very
it's only
interesting. Quite a few questions around how do you distinguish yourself from other organizations that seem to be doing somewhat similar work? Andrea actually in the chat answered that a bit, but perhaps briefly, CAMERA, we deal a lot with honest reporting. We're very proud of Honest Reporting Canada here in our jurisdiction because they are very good at countering the media headlines that seem often to be misrepresentative of the situation. How do you see yourself, the role of Flame versus other organizations that are dealing with the media per se?
We're completely different. So I'm glad you asked the question. Let me clear up the confusion. While we pay attention to the media, we don't do it like other organizations. We pay attention to the big picture issues. And then we are the only organization that publishes in media paid editorial messages that refute the lies that are in the media. So some other organizations will put out a press release saying, oh, the New York Times lied. Well, who reads the press release? Look, everybody is important. Every organization is important. We support all of them. But we are the only organization that actually proactively publishes positions and explains the truth to hundreds of thousands, millions of readers of these publications. No other organization does that.
Well, okay, so let me continue on sort of the tactic line of the questions. Let me lead in with one thing that I'm curious again about. I noticed that you were criticized back a number of years when you tried to stop some misinformation in a Berkeley newspaper, and you were criticized as the enemy of free speech. How do you deal with that kind of criticism?
Yeah, we're so happy that our efforts convinced advertisers that it was bad for their brand to be in a publication that published anti-Semitic messages. And that's what it was about. We never said that the Daily Planet, which was the name of the publication, we never said the Daily Planet should not be allowed to publish. We never said that the Daily Planet should not publish. What we did say is that anti-Semitism is hate speech, and we approached advertisers and we said, do you want to be associated with hate speech? And we explained to them why we considered what the Daily Planet had published, why it was hate speech. And it was indeed, and beyond a doubt, hate speech. And we convinced many advertisers to stop advertising in that publication. We do not oppose free speech. We're all for free speech, but we don't believe that advertisers should, and let me put it more starkly, because if it's anti-Semitism, somehow people think that others should get away with it. But what if somebody were publishing lies about Black people or about Hispanic people? Do you think that advertisers should advertise in a publication that issues messages of hate toward other ethnic minorities? No, I think not. That's not an issue of free speech. That's a matter of refusing to support hate.
Okay, so the next, I'm going to probably 3-4 questions touch on this. Your main goal is to get the facts out there as a way to counter anti-Semitism, as I understand it, using ads in major publications. So the questions seem to want to know more about the impact you're having. Are facts and logics going to make a difference where so much of the propaganda that we're dealing with is straight out lies? Specifically, let me give you an example that I thought was a good one from our audience, is how do you deal in facts and logic when so much of the anti-Israel propaganda is based on pictures and videos, which have been proven to be straight out misinformation, if not lies? And related to that, the sub question is, how do you go, what advice would you have to our audience to go about checking out the facts, learning more about the facts themselves so that they can be a strong voice against this propaganda machine?
Well, let me take the last question first, and then we'll work backwards. The answer to the last question is, I think it was slide 3 or 4, where I gave some resources. Flame has a collection of the editorial ads, as well as an archive of our weekly publication that answers pretty much factually, answers every single question that somebody could have, factual question about the main issues that people raise with regard to Israel. Now, how much impact do we have? Well, we know we have impact because a lot of people see us, a lot of people are inspired by us, a lot of people write to us, give us donations. It's very hard to measure public relations. It's very hard to measure the effect of an article that the New York Times writes, how many people saw it, how many people believed it. We're up against a fairly squishy area of marketing where it's difficult to measure. But let me put it this way. If we had the kind of resources that would enable us to run every week in the New York Times, I can tell you, and they would allow us to, but it doesn't have to be the New York Times. It can be the New York Post. It can be the LA Times, any number of dozens of publications. If we had more resources, we could run more often. But even if we don't, the measures that I suggested are a way to multiply the messages that go out there. What we have to do, the first thing you have to buy is the biggest problem that Israel faces socially and politically is misinformation and lies. The only way to beat misinformation and lies is to tell the truth. That's what Flame does. That's what you should do, the people on this call. That's my best answer for you. I can't give you statistics on, we think we probably had something to do with Ben and Jerry's, but it would be very difficult to prove. But there were lots of people fighting Ben and Jerry's. We don't have to argue about who did the best job. We all did a great job, and Unilever is paying the price.
Okay, so how do you choose which papers to put it in? And are you reaching, one of the questions I think related to that is by largely relying on ads in newspapers versus say social media, are you reaching the 40 crowd, the 25 crowd?
We have a very, I didn't mention it in the presentation, we have a very aggressive Facebook program, and people can find Facts and Logic about the Middle East on Facebook. I alluded to it several times in my presentation because we get 90% of the posts that we get are supportive of Israel, but 10% are viciously anti-Israel. And that's how we know kind of the temper of the times, or the slanders that are coming down out there in the public, and we see them over and over again. So we have a very aggressive Facebook presence. I will say to you, though, quite honestly, the people who have supported Israel over the last 30 years and the people who support it today tend to be an older audience. We hope we are priming younger people when they get older, when they have a few dollars to make donations, or when they become old enough to appreciate the importance of Israel, the miracle of Israel, that they will come around and support Flame.
I know we're running short time. Let me just go maybe one on the specific type questions, since your slides were very helpful on that. And maybe that it will relate to a broader area, but there was a lot of discussion both in the chat and the question and answer around about these different issues. Should we stop using the word Palestinian? Are we feeding into the lies that are fed about refugee status? I guess we don't have time to go into all these issues, but I think the overall question is, do you find certain issues are tougher than others? And who's making them tough? Because that's part B of that. Seems to me a number of the questions asked, who are your worst enemies out there? Are the groups that see themselves as aligned or part of the Jewish community stymieing, part of your work?
That's a lot of questions you have there, Anita.
I'm trying to put it all into one little category, but what are the tough issues, and who's making it tough for you, I guess?
Well, the toughest issues are the ones at the top of my list: apartheid, genocide, because they're such explosive, emotional accusations. And because most people don't know what apartheid really is, don't have a definition at hand, it's just a nasty word. It's like calling someone an a-hole. It's just a nasty word. And so those are difficult. Those are also not particularly simple questions to explain and to answer. I've tried to simplify them, but is Israel do Israel's settlements violate international law? They do not. But if you want to get into that conversation, it's not a short conversation, because you have to understand what is international law, and you have to get into it. I will comment about Palestinians. We get a lot of comments about this. Why do you keep calling them Palestinians? They're not Palestinians. They're not a people. We have decided that's not a battle that we want to fight. If they want to call themselves Palestinians, they can call themselves Palestinians. Just don't tell me that they were there when the Romans named it Palestine. The first Palestinians were Jews. The Palestine Philharmonic Orchestra, the Palestine Post, the newspaper. the first Palestinians were Jews. But so also, we don't call it the West Bank, we call it Judea and Samaria. It was only the West Bank while Jordan held it. So that's a very temporary label for it. So we decided we always explain what Judea and Samaria are, what it is, that it's the West Bank. So because nobody's going to know what you're talking about if you don't explain what Judea and Samaria are. It isn't part of the coin of the realm. So we explain it. Likewise, Palestinian is coin of the realm. People know what that is. Give it up. We call them Palestinian Arabs.
I'm going to jump in now
and-
because we are short of time. I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And thank you everyone for staying with us. Special thanks to James for being very really elucidating. The slides really help. We're going to share your slides with the audience, and I will send you some of the questions that Anita wasn't able to ask because we've had a lively number of people responding in chat and in Q&A. So I want to thank everybody. I want to remind everyone that you can be in correspondence with James and with CAEF. Both we will all respond. Both of us will respond. Our emails and our
Yes.
websites are easy to get to. It's Pesach tomorrow. I want to wish everyone a kosher Pesach, a happy time. We are celebrating freedom, and let us not forget that it's a fight every day to retain and to respect our freedom. It takes action. Thanks you, James, for pointing the way. Take
Chag Sameach. And
care.
who writes this crap?
Right. Thanks, everyone, and we'll speak again soon. Bye for now.